Let's talk then about this case that's come up. It's a free speech case, because I think this is worth commenting on because it is of interest.
Yeah.
So it's the case of Clive Johnston. He's a 76-year-old former president of the Association of Baptist Churches in Ireland. He's a grandfather of 7, and he is being prosecuted under abortion buffer zone laws in Northern Ireland for preaching an open-air sermon on John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible, arguably. Critical to this case, and the reason why it's of interest, is he never mentioned abortion. His sermon was not on abortion. And where we are at the moment is he's facing 2 charges under the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Act for holding an open-air Sunday service on the fringes of a buffer zone. And he's accused of seeking to influence people accessing the hospital's abortion services and for not immediately leaving the area when asked to do so by the police. If he is prosecuted and found guilty, he faces a criminal record and a maximum fine totaling thousands of pounds. He's never been in trouble with the police before. And just so everyone understands, in Northern Ireland, there are 8 100 to 150 metre buffer zones around hospitals and abortion facilities. And it's a criminal offence to impede, record, influence, or to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress within those areas. And this case has been taken up by the Christian Institute, who are arguing that nowhere in the legislation did it say anything about not being allowed to preach a gospel sermon, for example, in a buffer zone. And so the crucial question, the test that is now playing itself out here is, does abortion buffer zones and the policy that says you cannot influence, etc., does that mean that even speech that has got nothing to do with abortion is criminalised in that buffer zone area? Or is this a drafting error? Is this part of an evidence that shows you how difficult it is to police speech in any way, shape, or form? And therefore, such laws ultimately will always create these kind of problems. And also, the more concerning thing is, you could look at this very simply and say, here is a Christian man who's been prosecuted under the law of the land in a part of the United Kingdom because he preached a sermon on John 3:16. Well, however you look at it, that is pretty alarming.
I guess the question which the police are really going to have to answer is, why do they think just the presence of a Christian talking about Christian things which are not to do with abortion, why do they think that fits under that law?
Yeah, and do they even understand the law?
Yeah. Do they think that merely preaching about the fact that God so loved the world, do they think that is intimidating to a woman who is pursuing an abortion?
Yeah.
It is. I find cases like this quite tricky and frustrating, because we all know that this kind of situation shouldn't happen and that it is bizarre.
Yeah.
And yet we also know, I think, that as Christians we are not told to expect a right to free speech.
I think this is so important.
And that was not the experience of the early church.
No.
And they were brought in. You remember the story where Peter and John are brought in front of the Sanhedrin, and they've just healed someone, and the Sanhedrin are like, please. Well, not we don't say please. They will order them to stop talking about Jesus. Free speech has never been a Christian expectation, and Jesus said, "Look, if the world hates you, it hated me first."
Yes,
and so it's just that difficult tension, isn't it? When we think through it between what should happen and what we should expect.
And I think that's right. I think, blessed are you when you're persecuted. That seems to be the general expectation in the New Testament. The flip side of all of that being that the Apostle Paul, for example, used his rights as a citizen, used the mechanics of Roman law in order to be able to defend his right to continue his ministry. And so I think that when it comes to free speech, we have to balance what is our biblical expectation with, here is a right and a privilege that actually is good for all people and has been a blessing that we've enjoyed in the United Kingdom for successive generations. And therefore, it's not wrong to use the mechanics of the law that are open to us to make the case that this right should be protected and upheld.
Yeah.
And I think cases like this, you're absolutely right, they raise questions for the police, but they also raise questions for politicians.
Yeah.
Are they willing to put their hands up and go, politicians who supported the buffer zone law in Northern Ireland, will they put their hands up and go, that was never what this law was intended to do?
Yeah.
And this is wrong that this has happened. The police got this wrong. Now, that would be Fantastic if that happened. I highly doubt that it will. But I think this is one of those cases that will set a really, really interesting precedent for good or for ill in terms of how we apply and understand buffer zone laws and what you can or cannot say within them.
Well, yeah. Well, even to be fair, I mean, even here in England,
Yes.
When there have been cases like this, and then it's sort of been challenged, well, then the police have ended up losing the case, haven't
Yes,
they?
they have,
There was the case a couple of times with Isabel Vaughan Spruce,
Yes.
who was praying in her head outside an abortion clinic, and eventually the police were forced to back down on it. So it's difficult to know quite where it's going to land.
And I think, again, another tension here is that I can see an argument for saying, well, free speech facilitates the spread of the gospel.
Yep.
I can also see an argument for saying, well, God isn't limited in that way. So as in when the early church began meeting and the gospel spread and people were added to the church on a daily basis, they did not have the privilege of free speech. So God is not limited in the same way. And that gives us both confidence. And I do sometimes worry that the way free speech is kind of talked about by Christians here, it's as if we lost that, then everything would be lost. What utter nonsense.
That sort of implies we wouldn't keep preaching the gospel when clearly we would.
I want to see free speech upheld because I think, 1 Timothy 2, pray for those in authority, ultimately because God is Savior and there's one mediator and he wants people to come and be saved. I think it facilitates and helps gospel proclamation. But Acts 5:29, Peter and John, they say, you do what you want. We have to speak about God. We have to speak about Jesus.
We would obey God rather than
Absolutely.
Man,
so I think this is worth people being aware of this case. I think it is a precedent-setting case. And I think that it raises questions for the police, questions for politicians, and questions ultimately for society. Have we reached the limits of toleration with a Christian message on John 3:16 in the open air, or have we not? Now, I suspect what we will see, I hope what we will see, is common sense prevailing.
I think we will,
time will tell.